Good evening and welcome to Keese School. Tonight we're going to learn about artificial intelligence. It's what it's doing to us and why it's an important fact in all of our lives. The technical advances like data mining and machine learning have allowed the user of technologies to figure out things about us that we long thought were personal secrets. So your life is an open book, the way this goes. Large language models can model the way we express ourselves, composing essays, jokes, and even art. Now, the question comes, are the machines smarter than we are? Our speaker is Steve Gimbel, who's a professor of philosophy at Gettysburg College, and I'll guarantee you he's interesting to listen to, so thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Oh, goodness, wonderful room. So I'm Steve Gimbel. We're going to be talking tonight about artificial intelligence and artificial consciousness. Now, we live in a really interesting time that way, right? I mean, we've had computers now going back 50 years. And from the beginning, there was always this interest in our calculating machines that are capable of doing the sort of cognitive work that normally people do. Is it ever going to be possible that a machine like that could think? And that question goes back a whole lot farther than we think it does, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But we're at a really interesting point right now where we've got these large language models, ChatGPT, right? As a college professor, you know, I look at papers that I get. And I look at them skeptically. Now, we were saying at dinner, it used to be easy to spot the plagiarized paper because the C student suddenly hands in an A paper. But what you're seeing with ChatGPT is it's fascinating. It writes B- papers, which are usually the students who are looking to plagiarize papers. And so what we're seeing right now, and we're seeing the ChatGPT being used in fascinating ways that potentially do not just the sort of mechanical calculation work, but possibly even creative work. And so the question we want to wrestle with tonight is, could these machines ever themselves be conscious? Are they just facsimiles, representations of minds? Or at some point, do we have to, like that wonderful scene in 2001, right, with Hal? Dave? What are you doing, Dave? And at that point, it was a weird point in the movie, right? Because it seemed like there was a relationship between this computer scientist and this machine. It really did seem like he was pulling the plug on his friend. And so at what point is that more than just a metaphor? At what point are we not just anthropomorphizing these machines? At what point can we say, maybe that machine is a person? Maybe that machine is conscious. So that's what we want to play with tonight. So we'll start with a question that has nothing to do with machines. Let's start with Jim. Not a machine, right?
Right.
Thank you. So the idea is, Jim's not a machine. He's another person. He has a mind, right? The question, and only a philosopher might ask this, is how do we know? Now, we start back in the 1640s with a guy named René Descartes. Now, when I say René Descartes, anyone who's educated, what is immediately popping into mind? Very good, because it's actually written on the slide. But yes, Descartes is saying, I think, therefore I am. Now, that's his most famous quotation. What does it mean? Why did he say it? Well, Descartes was trying to reconstruct all of human knowledge. He wanted to know, what can we know? Right? What is it that I can't be wrong about? And he thought, well, wait a minute, there's, you know that I'm wearing pants. Why? Well, you could see them. Well, but sometimes optical illusions, dreams, we see things. How do I know that what I'm seeing is actually true? You can't actually trust your senses, he says, because, they could be wrong. And for him, even the slightest bit of doubt, throw it out. So, okay, I can't trust my senses. Well, I can trust reason. Well, anyone in here get 100% on every math test you ever took? No, we make reasoning errors. So Descartes, at this point in his book, The Meditations, was at a weird place where it seemed like every single thing that we could think, everything we believe could be doubted. And so for him, with this very high bar, it seemed like he could know nothing. And then he realized there is one thing that he could know with absolute certainty. He could know that he exists because he's thinking, right? Try doubting you exist. Well, who's doubting they exist? I do. Well, there you exist, right? So doubting is thinking is doing requires a doer. So if you're thinking, you must exist. There must be at least a thing doing the thinking to have the thought. So that's what I think, therefore I am means. So what it means is we can at least be assured of our own existence because we know our thoughts. We know what's in our own mind. You have access to this internal monologue, which probably is, who is this weirdo and why did they bring him on a Thursday night? Right? The idea here is we all know what we're experiencing. We know our internal life. But how do you know anything beyond that? You see me up here. How do you know I'm real? How do you know I'm not just a hologram or a hallucination or a dream? There are better things to dream about, but we have therapists for that. How do you know? How do you know that anything outside of your mind, right? Because where is your vision of me? It's not up here, it's in here. So can you get outside of your own mind? That's what Descartes was asking. Can I get from the internal experience to an external world? And let's say we solved that problem. Okay, so the external world exists, but how do I know that Jim's not just a very cleverly built robot? Possible, right? What's the difference between Jim and that jacket that's sitting next to him? You need more friends. Right? He can think, right? That's what makes him a person. He has a mind, or, Descartes used the word soul, but in Latin, those two words actually meant the same thing, right? So how do I know Jim's got a mind? Well, all I know about Jim is what I see. Couldn't he be a robot? And Descartes asked this question before we even had the concept of a robot. He used the word automaton, which meant robot. How do I know? And the reason he's asking this question, it's interesting. In 1640s Paris, they started to build these hydraulic statues. So you look through Europe, there are all the fountains, right? So you have a statue with the water's coming out of the mouth or coming out of a jug. Well, they realized what they could do is take the statue, carve the limbs, and maybe at the waist, insert hydraulic gears. Take the water that was going to be pumping through it, pump it through tubes, and you actually had statues that moved. Now, you could run it through the equivalent of a calliope, and now you could have, say, a lyre player who is moving and making music. And so from a distance, what do you see? You see a figure playing an instrument, and you hear the music. Is that statue alive? Now, we think that's absurd, but wait a minute. It's moving. It's making sound. So in the 1640s, this was amazing technology. This was Hal of the 1640s. Could this be alive? And so the question was asked. Now, Descartes answers it in an interesting metaphysical way, right? He argues that human beings are interesting in that we are a combination of two different sorts of things. We are both matter and spirit, right? That's what we call metaphysical dualism, right? And as a Catholic, he wanted to say that there is the body and there is the soul, and they're different things, and somehow they interact. How do they interact? That was a problem he had to try to solve. But the statues are only matter. Okay, so there's an easy way of saying that the statue can't be alive. But what about Jim? How do we know he is a person? If we don't have direct access to his mind, because he's the only one who has access to his mind, how do we know he's a person? How do we know there are other minds? How do we know we're not just seeing a room full of just robots, matter? How do we know? Well, a French philosopher of the next generation named de Courtemoy and an Irish philosopher named Bishop Berkeley came up with the same general answer, right? So you can imagine Jim, but your imaginary Jim, you could have a conversation with him, right? You ask imaginary Jim a question, what's his answer? Well, who has to come up with the answer? You do, right? Okay, I'm going to ask you to say a word in a minute. I want everyone to predict what you think the word is going to be that Jim says.
Language.
Ooh, how many people guessed language? No, you didn't. Right? The idea is we didn't know, and yet we heard him say it. So that couldn't have come from us because imaginary Jim, you knew what he was going to say because you put the word in his mouth. Here, it seemed like the fact that we can have an interesting conversation, and we did over dinner, right? The fact that you can have a conversation with someone and not know how they're going to reply, which is what makes it an interesting conversation, right, for those of you who have been married for long periods of time, right? The idea is that's how you know the other person is a person. Because they use language in ways we don't expect. They say things we didn't know they were going to say. And that seems to say that that linguistic contribution was outside of our control and therefore had to come from the robot. But the robot is now doing cognitive work. Having a conversation requires having ideas, having thoughts, usually. So the idea is because we will have interesting conversations with people where they give us new ideas we had never thought about and express them through language and thereby put that idea in my mind, there had to have been a mind to come up with that idea. And so at this point, we're in the 1660s, we have seemingly a solution to the problem of other minds. How do we know that other minds exist? Because they're creating novel ideas that can be put in my mind. That is, I can have conversations with them. They're doing the sort of thing that only a mind can do. And so if we look at the sorts of things that only a mind can do, that must be evidence that we have a mind. Well, so in the next generation, we have the invention of calculating machines. And the person who first comes up with the idea of a mechanical calculator is a philosopher named Blaise Pascal. You may know him, his most famous contribution to thought is Pascal's wager, right? The argument that here's why one ought to believe in the existence of God. But he writes a piece called The Virtue of Laziness. And in it, what he argues is that even things that seemingly require a human mind, mathematics, could be done by a machine. And so he basically comes up with the first instruction manual for building a calculator that can add and subtract. Ooh. Well, the next generation, we have a guy named Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz. Leibniz was the co-creator of calculus, along with Isaac Newton. The reason why most of you have never heard of him is Isaac Newton, who was incredibly insecure and made sure to wipe away virtually all references to Leibniz so that he and he alone was given credit for inventing calculus, as if he didn't do enough. But Leibniz actually built what he called a stepped reckoner, which is basically the first mechanical calculator. And it was built with cogs that were shaped like cones, which allowed him to manipulate dials, which could actually add, subtract, multiply, and divide. So think back to elementary school, how hard it was to do long division, right? It takes a while to figure out how to do it. He actually built a machine where you could turn the dials, turn a crank, and the answer to a division problem would just come out. And that amazed people because, look, this is not trivial. This is something that's hard for us, right? How many people had difficulties with math back in third grade learning division, right? A machine could do what you were cognitively having a tough time to do. That was amazing. And so the question was, if I have to think to do division, and it does division, is it thinking? Now, Leibniz also is the guy who first comes up with formal rules of logic. Now, Aristotle has 5 rules for determining when a given type of logical argument is valid, but it's Leibniz who first comes up with the sort of way to determine whether an argument is a good argument using mechanical steps to accurately calculate the validity or invalidity of an argument. And so by taking logic, and I mean, think about what logic is. Logic is the rules of proper thinking. And he comes up with an algorithm, a mechanical way of determining whether a thought is a good thought. Notice what that's doing. It's starting to mechanize our ability to think. And so by coming up not only with this new calculator, but with mechanical ways of determining whether a thought is a good thought, this question about non-humans being able to think, all of a sudden, and here we're in the 1670s, long before Hal. Could it be that thought is not just the province of something like Jim? Then we hit the 1830s. Charles Babbage comes up with the first recognizable programmable computer. He's at Cambridge. Ada Lovelace was the first computer programmer. Here we are at the end of March, Women's History Month. Ada Lovelace is one of those names that should be known to all human beings and isn't. She was the first computer programmer, wrote the first program on Babbage's analytical engine to compute Bernoulli numbers. It's a series of numbers that are of use in physics. That was a computation that was usually done by advanced math students. And here we had a machine doing it faster and better. Students who, in order to be able to do it, had to be taught. Ooh, what does it mean to teach? It means you have a professor who professes, and students who, if they're awake, take notes and figure something out, right? Teaching is thought here, comes out here, goes in here, hopefully comes out here. Isn't that what Ada Lovelace did with that machine? She programmed the computer. I mean, am I programming my students? That's a different question. But that program taught Babbage's analytical engine. So it doesn't seem, even in the 1800s, an absurd question to wonder, can a machine think? I'm going to get that right one time. So the person who first gives us a way to answer that question is a man named Alan Turing. Again, another name that should be household. He was one of the great geniuses of humanity. He is one of the reasons we won World War II, defeating the Nazis. And this was back in the era where the Nazis were the bad guys. And the Nazis had come up with the uncrackable code. Right? Exactly, the Enigma code. And the British had code crackers who were human beings, very smart, most of them mathematicians, who would get encoded messages and would sit down and, using their intellect, try to break the code. Now, the Polish logicians were able to break the initial Enigma code, and so the Nazis ramped it up. And at Bletchley Park, which was, sort of the Langley CIA headquarters for the British intelligence, they were just banging their head against it. They could not crack the code. Well, along comes Turing. Now, Turing's story is one of the great tragedies of intellectual history. He was an odd duck, most likely autistic. He was also gay at a time when that was illegal. And as a young man, was very isolated. Nerds often are. It's okay, here's a therapy. And he was an outsider, always sort of shunned. And in high school, he met a young man named Christopher Morcom. And he fell in love. And he had his first crush, and they became romance, and how sweet it was. Well, he finally, you got to remember, this is, an outcast. He's autistic, he's nerdy, he's gay, right? This is not a person who has friends, who suddenly has the love of his life, who dies. He had some tainted milk, and it ended up creating a medical situation where he passed away. And that just broke his heart, and it remained that way to his dying day. And so the idea of artificial intelligence is not, for Turing, a scary thing. So when we think of it, we think of science fiction with, the computer taking over and destroying humanity. The idea of artificial intelligence for Turing meant that if he could create a person, maybe he could choose what person he's going to create. And if you could create any person in the world, who would you create? The love of your life, who was taken from you. And so for him, the idea of artificial intelligence was actually an attempt to bring back the person he loved, which is really kind of sweet and romantic, unlike ChatGPT that just lets students cheat on assignments. So he goes on to become an important mathematician. Now, in the 1930s, a guy named Kurt Gödel, and this was somebody we talked about actually over dinner, comes up with the incompleteness theorem, and I won't talk too much about that. But what it is this important mathematical result about what can be calculated and what can't be calculated. And so Turing is a student when this comes out. And so Turing realizes, wait a minute, I can take this idea of what can be calculated and turn it actually into a mechanical procedure. And he comes up with the idea of what has come to be called a Turing machine, which is just a mechanical means, it was never actually built, of determining whether a given sentence could be deduced within a mathematical system. And with that, he realized, I could use this to model human thought calculationally. I could use this machine that came in order to illustrate this abstract metamathematical principle in a way that modeled the most intricate logic we had as human beings. And so that's what he did. He built the first electronic computer. He built it at Bletchley Park, and it was used to crack the Enigma code. He did it. He built a computer, and that computer outsmarted the Nazis. And with that, we were able to crack their code, so we could then get their communications. They thought the code couldn't be cracked, so they would just broadcast to their people who had the machines to decode it, and they thought there was no way they'd know what we're doing. Except now the Brits did know. And with that advanced knowledge, they were able to create strategies that ultimately, in the end, won World War II. And so Alan Turing is an essential piece of our success in this awful war. You would think that would make him a war hero, right? Well, no, right? Because in the end, he ends up on trial and chemically castrated for being gay. He ends up living a sort of very, very sad life. In the end, he actually commits suicide by eating a poisoned apple, an idea he got from Snow White. But the idea here for him was not just to win World War II, which clearly he wanted to do, but the idea of this computer, he built something that could outthink all of the living mathematicians, right? There was a room of the smartest code crackers in all of Britain, and they couldn't do what his machine did. His machine was smarter than them. It thought. Couldn't it be a person? Did he take the first step in rebuilding Christopher? Did he hoped, figure out a way to actually create artificial intelligence, a being that wasn't born but could still have a mind? Because that's what a human is, right? It's a material body with a mind. Did he create the ability to endow a material object with a mind? Could he have created a person? So he had to figure out how to determine whether it did have a mind. And so in 1950, he writes the most famous paper in computer science, in which he asks this question. How do we know whether these machines are just machines, or are they intelligent? At what point do we have to say of a machine that it can think? And so he derives what we now call the Turing test. Okay, so what's the Turing test? He says, okay, let's step aside from machines for a minute and think about a party. So you're having a party at somebody's house full of people. A small group of people decide to play a game, a party game called the imitation game. So they go into another room, and a guest from the party, we don't know who it is, goes into a closet, closes the door. The people who are playing have a pad of paper and a pen. They write 10 questions on the pad, slip the pad into the closet. The person in the closet answers the questions, slips the pad back out, and then the people who are playing have to guess whether that's a man or a woman in the closet. Fun party game. People in closets, indeterminate gender. Yeah, he was gay. So the idea, it's a fun party game. Turing says, okay, let's play the same game with a computer. Now you got to remember, for him, a computer was just a large room full of wiring. He had to come up with the idea of a screen and a keyboard, and created what we now call a computer terminal. And he says, okay, same game as in the party, but now we ask 10 questions using the keys, and it could be a computer that answers, or it could be a person on the other end who types an answer. And instead of guessing the sex, now you have to guess whether it's a person or a computer. And what he says is, if we get computers to the point where we guess as many times right as we guess wrong, so that we literally can't tell whether we're conversing with a person or a computer, then the computer would have to be intelligent. Why? Go back to Jim. Remember what we said several slides ago. How do we know Jim's a person? Because we can have interesting conversations with Jim, right? See, we're having one. So the fact that we can have a conversation with Jim is what gives us reason, going back to the 1640s, to think that's a human being. So if I'm having a conversation with a computer, that is just as fascinating as my conversation with Jim, and it's on the basis of that conversation that I attribute a mind to Jim, wouldn't we also, on the very same logic, have to attribute a mind to the computer? Huh. And so that's what we call the Turing test. Now, turns out that's been passed. I'll work from the bottom up. Back in the 1960s, we had ELIZA was the first attempt to create something that passed the Turing test. In 2000, we had a chatbot, well, the first chatbot called Alice. We now have Siri and Alexa, right? They passed the Turing test. You can talk to them and they respond, right? In the 1980s, it was a big deal that they had come up with one that was sophisticated enough that it acted like a therapist. And people actually felt better after talking to it. So the idea is, okay, it seems like the Turing test has been passed. So we have artificial intelligence, right? It should leave us very uncomfortable. It's like, well, no, because it's just acting as if it's a human being. It's not a human being. It's just, even go back to Turing's initial idea, it was called the imitation game, right? I mean, if you get a meal with imitation crab, are you eating crab? Mrs. Maryland, no, you are not. Right? The idea is an imitation is a fake. So here we have something imitating intelligence. And the person who first put this in a philosophical argument was a guy named John Searle, he's still alive. He's a professor, he's retired now, at UCal Berkeley. One of his most famous papers is the one in which he formulates what he calls the Chinese room argument. So he says, okay, consider Bob. Who's Bob? Bob's a guy in Northern California who needs a job. He's looking through the paper. He sees an ad, for a job at Berkeley. He goes, he applies, they give Bob the job. Now, Bob does not speak Chinese, not a single word. He's the kind, he goes in a Chinese food restaurant, he needs a fork, right? He can't order off the menu, right? Bob knows nothing about Chinese. His job is to sit in a room. It's a room with a whole bunch of books and a door that's closed with a slot. Now, there are people at Berkeley who do speak Chinese. And they come by and they take a slip of paper and they write a question in Chinese, slip it through the slot. Bob picks up the paper, looks at the characters, no idea what they mean, goes to the books tell him based on this character, then that character, go here, go there, okay, and then write this down, and so he writes characters that mean nothing to him on the other side of the paper. He slips it back through the hole. What's on the paper? a reasonable answer to the question on the other side. So what just happened? Somebody who is a fluent speaker of Chinese asked a question. They received an answer in Chinese. Is this person having a conversation? Sure seems like it. Who are they talking to? Are they talking to Bob? Bob's the only human mind other than the writer. But Bob doesn't speak Chinese. He has no idea what he said. He had no idea what was said to him. So he didn't answer the question. Did the room answer? Can rooms talk? Now would be the time in the back if you had a mic to say yes. Right? But the idea is, no, rooms can't talk. Yet it sure seems like there's a conversation. It seems like we've passed the Turing test. And yet, surely we haven't, right? That room isn't talking. So what we have here is just a simulation, right? A facsimile, a fake, an imitation of the conversation that we then can't use as the sort of evidence we think. So he distinguishes, Searle does, between weak and strong artificial intelligence. Weak artificial intelligence is successful imitation of a human mind. Strong artificial intelligence is actually having a mind, actually being conscious. So we could think of it as intelligence versus consciousness. And we can create a computer that will look as if it is, but it's just an imitation. And so the question for us is whether the strong version is even possible. What would a computer have to do to make the move from something that looks as if it's intelligent to actually being a conscious entity? Do you know? That's the question. Could we even have a conscious machine? Now, on the one hand, there are those who say, why not? Right? I mean, if we were to go to Jim and, pop his top, right? What's inside the skull? That's a brain, which is just matter. Couldn't we design a material system like his cognitive material system? Seems like it's possible. If the human mind is just a brain and the brain is just made up of atoms, couldn't we put atoms together in the right configuration to create something which is conscious? Doesn't seem like that's an impossibility. How would we know? Well, again, let's go from the bottom. The argument is that there's a difference between, say, a machine. Let's take something simple that actually makes a decision. Let's talk about the heat in your room. You have a thermostat. You set your thermostat to a temperature. It monitors the room. If it's too cold, it turns on the heat until the temperature gets to the right, then it turns the heat off. And if it gets too hot, it turns on the AC until it cools down, and then it turns it off. It's making decisions. Is your thermostat intelligent? Weakly, but is your thermostat conscious? Now, your spouse may be going, could you turn the heat on? It is freezing in here. In which case, your spouse is now acting like a thermostat, right? Monitoring the temperature, making a decision. So what's the difference between the thermostat and your spouse? You never had to go to therapy with your thermostat. Right? The idea here is, what is the difference? Well, the difference is that while both could monitor the temperature, both of them can figure out, oh, the room is cold. There's only one who felt cold. And it's that feeling of cold. That's what we call qualia. Not just the understanding of the temperature. This is the difference between the thermometer in the mouth and mom putting the back of her hand on the head, right? One feels the heat, the other just detects it. So can a machine ever have that experience of being cold? Huh. The other seeming difference is creativity. Can a computer be creative? Now, we have these large language models like ChatGPT. You put in a prompt and things come out. We were talking over dinner of, these large language models writing plays, some of which might be funny, some of which might be tragic, and they might be as good as the mediocre playwright. Is it being creative? Now, in this case, we know it had to be fed in certain things, but it creates something new. At Stanford, there was a guy named David Cope who created a machine where you could feed in, say, the works of Bach, and it would create a work like that was almost indistinguishable from Bach's compositions. Is that machine a composer? The Italian computer scientists Cella and Manzotti created a computer that was capable of sitting in, it basically was a keyboard player, of sitting in with a jazz quartet. And so in real time, jamming with the musicians, right? So think about what jazz is you have the chart, but then you solo over it, but you have to be listening to each other in order to play off of each other. And so surely live performance requires this sort of interactivity that seems to require a consciousness. The fact that this machine could improvise with jazz players the way a normal keyboard player would, does that mean it's creative? Does that mean it has soul? Both in the metaphorical and literal sense here. You're starting to see computerized joke creators. You have programs that make jokes. Now, most of them are really bad pun-based dad jokes. But being someone who regularly comes up with very bad pun-based dad jokes, I don't want to be put out of that business either. Is it funny? Well, as funny as I am. Is it being creative by coming up with these jokes? Well, Douglas Hofstadter, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning author and a professor at the Indiana University, argues no. That yes, we can have these machines, but again, this is just imitation. Impressive imitation, incredibly impressive imitation, but just imitation. It's code, it's an algorithm. A complex algorithm that works incredibly fast, required very smart people to put together, but still just the result. It's a necessary result of the algorithmic processing. What makes Jim Jim is that we can't be sure what that next word is going to be. Right. There does seem to be a difference there, even if we get so good at imitation that it's imitating creativity. But is it a mere imitation? And so this is where we sit today with this question, because the imitation has become uncanny. What it's able to do is a stunning array of things that we thought we needed people for, right? We just had the writers in Hollywood out on strike. And what was the central question they were striking over? The use of artificial intelligence in writing movie and television scripts. The studios say, look, Why do I need a writer's room of 12 people putting together Saturday Night Live sketches when you've been churning out mediocre stuff since the mid-'80s? I could get mediocre stuff from a computer. I don't have to pay the computer. It doesn't take sick leave. Professors, are we going to be needed? So if the imitation is good enough, is it equivalent? At what point are we going to see these really weird things that we now know turned over to decision-making machines? So you're starting to see it in medicine. You're starting to see it, like I say, in the arts. Things that we thought were the province of human beings. The ability to collect data on all of us. Every time you're online looking at something, it knows. And the result is now we can use these incredibly powerful computers to do fascinating things. Turns out the computer can tell if you're cheating before your spouse does. There are certain telltale signs that you don't even know you're leaving. The great story is that a father got very angry at the corporation Target for sending his daughter flyers for maternity stuff. My daughter is not pregnant. Turned out she was. Target knew before she did. If you buy a new brand of coffee, you probably bought a new house. There are all these really interesting things. They did this study at MIT where they gave the students free cell phones. This was back before the smartphone was ubiquitous, where they were expensive. And so they said, we'll give you a smartphone to use for the semester. We will not read any of your texts. We will not listen into any of your phone calls. We just want what's called the metadata. That is, who you're calling, how long, from where. They were able, by the end of the semester, to accurately predict in the morning which student was going to be staying in their own dorm room and which ones were not. Probably, in some cases, before the student had even made the decision. And so the question then becomes, are we even human? Are these computers capable of being like us, or do we reduce to being like them? And these are the questions that we're now being left with. What's the answer? Well, as a philosopher, I'm really glad there isn't a straightforward one, because I have 2 kids to put through college, and I need to stay and work. So with that, why don't we throw it open to a general conversation? Thank you. Oh, there is a microphone coming. Oh, here it comes. There are 2 coming down the aisles. Questions, concerns, interests, anybody? Oh, I can use the whole stage now. Oh, there's a hand.
If we have artificial intelligence now, ChatGPT, other chatbots, do they respond differently if you ask the question differently? Example, I say, give me 3 examples of scientific discoveries. Or I say, oh, you're a world-renowned scientist with a PhD and a Nobel Prize. Tell me 3 wonderful things about science. Do I get 2 different answers because I've asked the question as if they were human?
That's a very interesting question. It's testable. My guess, we'd have to do the experiment, but I'm pretty sure you would get different answers. And what's interesting in the case of a large language model like ChatGPT is even given the same prompt, you will get subtly different answers. So one way that I wish I could detect these papers is what the students do is now, it used to be you had tests handed out on paper to you. Now everything's on the computer. So they just copy and paste it into ChatGPT. I get similar but different answers, even though I know they both use ChatGPT. Now, you'd think that because they're different, that does seem to indicate something like volition, something like will, right? Because notice when we went to gym, we got different words. Here we go to ChatGPT, we're getting different words. So again, I don't think that necessarily would then be an indication of consciousness, but you're right, it's now responding much more human-like. And that's what's scary and that's what's interesting. So I mentioned Douglas Hofstadter. One of the things he sets out as a test, he said that we'll know that we have artificial intelligence when the computer makes mistakes of the same kind that we make. And what he says is computers can really screw something up, but they really screw something up differently than we do. And so they're different kinds of errors, which gives you a sense that they are different sorts of processing. And so, there are. I was saying during dinner, one of my former students, who's now a colleague of mine, fed into ChatGPT, describe the work of philosopher Stephen Gimbel. And what came out was, that I'm a philosopher of physics, but it said that my most prominent work is a book called Einstein's Junk Drawer, A Field Guide to the Philosophy of Physics. That book does not exist. I never wrote that book. But the weirdest thing was, the minute he said that, I was like, oh my God, that's such a great title. That is absolutely a title I would come up. I would completely write that book. And so it got it wrong, but in a way that was so close to being right. I mean, I will admit, I've now sat down and thought, what would I write if I wrote this book with that title? So maybe it just, got the timing wrong. But the idea is that, it gets things wrong, but wrong in a different way than humans do. And so what Hofstadter is worried about is that, he's not terribly worried because he thinks it's a difference in kind. It's not just a technological line we haven't crossed. But he's like, there will always be this way that you can see that the errors are of a different kind. So,
it seems to me that a lot of the examples that you cited by the people, the scientists in the past, you've used the term conversation, but it's really been a question and answer. And is there any development in an area where there's something that's iterative and reactive, which is what I consider human conversation? If a group of computers is writing a play, can they take criticism and say, tighten up this, your laugh lines came too late, and react to that constructively in a way that you would recognize as human? Is anybody working on something like that? Because it seems to me that anything that you described is pure mechanics. It may be complicated, but it is not conversation by any stretch of the imagination.
yes, and that's a wonderful question. That's actually very much in line with my one contribution to this discourse. So what you're saying is, look, you can have question and answer, but could you actually have a discussion in the way that human discussion actually occurs? And the idea of taking criticism, I think, is fantastic, because what you're doing there is, wait a minute, I see it this way. I want you to understand how I see it, and I want you to adjust to my understanding of it, which requires you understanding how I see it. And it's that sense of this deeper notion of conversation. And you can have a chat with ChatGPT. It will ask you questions. It will discuss things with you. But this question that I think you're trying to take one step deeper is in this way of the meeting of the minds, which requires two minds to meet. And so, like I say, the one place where I've published something in this area, I published it with a guy named Cliff Presser, who's a colleague of mine in computer science at Gettysburg, and a former student, Paul Mogenese, who was a philosophy, computer science double major. What we were asking was a slightly different question, which is, let's say, hypothetically, just for the sake of argument, that we did have a computer that was conscious. So we've passed strong AI. It really is a conscious being. How would you know? What test could you use to separate that from just a really good imitation? Right? Which seems to be the heart of what you're getting at, which is, in order to have the meeting of the minds, you need two minds. How do I know when I'm dealing with another mind? And the test we came up with, which is, not necessary, but might give us a sufficient limit, had to do with jokes. So we talked about computer programs that can write jokes. Well, we now have what we call machine learning algorithms, which is that it receives feedback. So here's where we get to the criticism, incorporates it, and comes out with a better model. So we have machines that improve themselves. Now, without consciousness, machine learning is purely algorithmic, but if you give it criticism, it can respond to the criticism if you do it in a way that it understands the criticism. And so you will have, let's say, a mapping program. So we all have seen Google Maps, which says if I want to drive from here to Philadelphia, here's the shortest route, except now on Route 30, there's an accident, so take 222 around. And what's happening is it can learn, it can get better and better at a task. And so what we asked is, well, okay, let's say you had one of these computer-generated joke writers. You connected it, you added in a machine learning algorithm. What should happen? The jokes should get funnier. And what we said is, consider the idea of a dad joke. Right? What is a dad joke? It's a bad joke that the teller knows is a bad joke. So I live out 270 in Frederick County. And so when we would drive, there would frequently be large trucks with bales of dried grass. And my kids being teenagers, of course, their heads are down in the phone. And so when we passed a truck like this, I would go, "Hey!" And they would immediately look up and see, "Hey." And they would roll their eyes and go back to their phones. And how often would I do this? Every single time. Did I know it was not funny? Yes, I knew it was not funny. Did I keep doing it? Of course I did. Why? I enjoyed it. And so what we thought was, if we had a machine that was a joke generator connected to a machine learning algorithm, then we ought to be able to chart its jokes getting funnier. If every once in a while you found a joke that it would repeatedly tell that it should know is less funny and therefore should reject, but tells it anyway, so we came up with the idea of a biological autodidactic joke. Something is autodidactic if something is driving it. So a biological autodidactic joke is when a biological entity tells a joke because it finds it funny. Well, if a computer did it, it would be a digital autodidactic joke, or a DAD joke, which itself is a dad joke. And so if you started to have computers telling jokes that it knew we wouldn't find funny, that might be evidence that you have volition. And so bad jokes might be the key to detecting artificial consciousness. But it goes back to this question of being able to understand criticism in terms of what it is that somebody else wants. And either in your case was bringing, realigning the creative work to be along the lines that the other mind wanted. Whereas ours was disregarding the other mind and just doing what I wanted. Either one would seem to indicate this sense of a deeper intelligence, of consciousness. And so, are people working on that? Yeah, they are. Is it going to run up against a limit? That's the question. Oh, lots of hands.
Hi, I think most of us spent our whole lives having people ask, what's your IQ?
Oh.
What were your SAT scores? But in the past, say, 30, 40 years, there's been a lot of research on emotional intelligence, IQ, EQ.
Right.
Where does EQ fit into the picture of AI?
That's a really good question. And what's interesting is, like I say, back in the 1980s, we did have computerized therapists. And you'd think the therapist has to have, right, the high EQ because they have to hear what the patient is saying and process it in a way to help them have breakthroughs. And so you did have, like I say, back in the 80s, computerized therapists. So could you imitate emotional intelligence? Well, I mean, sociopaths do it well. So could you have a computerized sociopath? Or is artificial intelligence like sociopathy in that sort of way? Maybe. So I don't know. That's a good question, is whether once you had, let's say, a computer that could experience qualia, could experience love, right, the way that Turing had hoped. So is that possible? And that's a good question that I wish I had an answer for.
One more question.
Oh, uh-oh. I don't have a mic, don't look at me.
Is there a back door to turn this thing off? I want to know when I'm on that spaceship, I can turn Hal off. Can you answer that question?
I wish I could. We all saw how that movie ended. That is the question. And part of the question is, what do we give over to the machine to be able to do, right? There was that wonderful movie with Matthew Broderick in the 80s, War Games, where the guy in the movie where they go out to Washington State and find him on an island, that was actually modeled on Turing. And notice it was his son who died instead of his lover because it was the 1980s. But the idea is that they had turned over in this film, right, determination whether we go to DEFCON 3 to the machine, which now has a problem with its programming. And so I think it's a fair question. At this point, we have these systems, we're implementing them, we can build those safeguards in. Please, I think, is the right answer. Will we? It depends how wise we are. Oy.
Okay, one more question. Go ahead.
Can they formulate purpose towards fulfillment of one's nature?
Ooh, and so there it is. I mean, what you're asking
Can
in
you
essence.
repeat the question, please? Yeah.
So the question is, could a computer have a purpose that it's exploring its own nature? Basically, could computers ever do philosophy? So we might put mathematicians out of business. We might put script writers out of business. What you're asking is, are they ever going to put me out of business? I mean, I'm hoping to retire in 10 years, so hopefully it takes that long. But what you're asking, in essence, is the ultimate test of consciousness itself. That is, a sense of self. An abstract sense of self beyond, I mean, you could set up a robot with a thermometer to know it's hot and to turn off the heat. But that's purely mechanical. Can you ever have a machine that sees itself as a self? That contemplates its essence? That's a hard question. I actually wrote a piece with a colleague of mine, Stephen Stern, who is the chair of Jewish Studies at Gettysburg College. And we asked a similar question, except that what we asked it was, let's say you have a computer that could ask those sorts of questions. Those are the central questions of human spirituality. So when we look at the traditional proofs for the existence of God, they come in two flavors, right? On the one hand, you get people like, say, Thomas Aquinas, who argues causally for the existence of God, that God exists as a creator, and there must be a first cause, and that cause is God. On the other hand, you have people like Saint Anselm, who argue that God must exist as a perfect being. So God exists as a sense of perfection. Well, what's interesting is when you look at artificial intelligence, let's hypothetically just say that such a program could exist. It's, in a certain sense, a perfected human because it's perfectly rational. As the perfection of us, would that make it our God? On the other hand, we're the thing that created it. Would we be its God? And so the question you're asking is the profound one. Could a machine ever have an existential crisis? Could it wonder who it is? What makes me me? What is my purpose? I don't know, but if it humbled them, maybe that would lead it to turning exactly the questions back over to us, where hopefully some of them belong.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
That's just terrific. Yeah. I wish we could